starting today a new section of it's not a new book, but a new section of halacha. We just concluded the laws of tefillah, and we are diving into the laws of tefillin, which of course have a lot of technical ritual attached to them, but also great spiritual significance. I heard a story once from a fellow, Dr. Alexander Polichenko. He was a very prominent member of the Jewish community in Mexico. He was a computer scientist, and he was a computer scientist before I think any of us, present company included, were into computers in the 60s and the 70s. That was really his work, and it was very rare. And he once came for an audience. He was having a discussion with the Rebbe, and he says, you tell me that everything in Torah has a source. He says, we're developing this new idea, this computer technology. What's the source of it in Torah? And the Rebbe asks him, what is the computer, essentially? It's not a revolution in human thinking, right? It's essentially taking many, many different components or elements of human data acquisition, development, thought, science, etc., and streamlining it all into one consolidated synergist space, so that it all works together much better. And he said that's exactly tefillin. The effect of tefillin on a human being is the same as ideally what computer science would be. To take the multiplicity, the fragmented state of the human condition, and bring a sense of oneness in it and tying it all into one purpose. And as it's known that when we put on the tefillin, what is the idea? It's essentially the tefillin shal yad. I'm sorry that I'm using my right hand. I'm a lefty. You'll forgive me. But the tefillin shal yad that we tie on the hand, on the bicep, is near the heart, because it's essentially tying the hand, the feelings, to the and by extension the actions, because we act the way we feel. Essentially, we tie that, and the tefillin shel rosh, the head tefillin, is of course binding the mind, the thought. So we're going to take a deep dive into the text, and as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to share. Okay. So the Rambam begins as follows. Hilchis Tefillin, Hakdama, the introduction to Hilchis Tefillin, they contain Tefillin, Mezuzah, and Sefer Torah contains five positive mitzvahs, which are: 1, liyas tefillin al rosh, the tefillin to be placed on our heads; 2, to tie the tefillin to our arms; 3, to affix a mezuzah at the entrance to our gates; 4, for every man to write a Torah scroll for himself; and 5, for a king to write a second scroll for himself, so that he will have 2 Torah scrolls. And the explanation of these mitzvot is contained in the following chapters. Now, there's a question that all the commentaries ask right here on the Rambam already, on the order of how these are placed, particularly the first 2, but it's a question not only here, but seems to run through the entire Hilchis Tefillin. And it's a pretty obvious question, if anybody wants to guess what it might be on these 2, the order of them. Come now, Kent, you be the brave one. You're on mute.
Sequence. You would normally put on the arm before the head.
You put the tefillin on your hand before your head. It should have been first, number 1, to tie the tefillin to your hand, to your arm, and then to put the tefillin on your head. That's not only a question of the order of how the mitzvah is performed, but it's also in the verse, which we all know from the Shema. To tie it to our hands, and then to our head. Why does the Rambam reverse the order? And we'll see it now when it comes to the writing of the parchments, and as we go through the next few days, the insertion of the parchments, the making of the boxes, the putting on. The Rambam always talks about the head tefillin first, and the question is why? Why put the tefillin on the head first? And the answer is, first, from a literal perspective, look at the mitzvah. What is the mitzvah? Okay, lihiyos tefillin al harosh. Now he adds in here in the brackets for tefillin to be placed, but that's not exact translation. The exact translation is for tefillin to be on the head. The mitzvah is for tefillin to be resting on your head. The mitzvah for the hand tefillin is different, however. It's to tie it. So let's say today we wear our tefillin for, I don't know, maximum an hour. But let's take it to the earlier times when, as we'll read later, they wore tefillin for the whole day. But even in today's context, when you're only wearing the tefillin for an hour, how long are you performing the mitzvah of the head tefillin for? If the mitzvah is for it to be there on your head, and you're wearing it for an hour, how long are you performing it for? An hour. Okay? Whereas the mitzvah, the tefillin shel yad, where the mitzvah is to tie it, how long are you performing the mitzvah for?
1 minute.
Literally a few seconds. Okay? Why? Because it's only the time that it took to tie. And in reality, the main actor of the performance of the mitzvah of tefillin is what? It's the head tefillin. The hand tefillin is a supporting act. Now, there are different customs, which we'll get to in the later chapters, about whether you make 2 blessings or 1 blessing. But essentially, there are 2 sides to one mitzvah, and the primary mitzvah is the tefillin on our head. And just to tie it back to what we said earlier, what's the mitzvah of tying tefillin to our hand? To subdue our heart to the will of Hashem. The tefillin on the head is to subdue our thoughts, our mind. Now, I can't speak for any of you, but for myself, I can say the heart is a raging beast. It's an untamable animal. And the most you can do is contain it. Thoughts you have much more control over feelings. And so therefore, the act of tying the heart to Hashem's will is in the moment that you do it. Whereas the act of tying the mind to Hashem, that's one that flows for a much longer time, to the extent that it could be called one of the mitzvahs tidiros. Okay, but I don't want to get too much detail because we have quite a few halachas to cover. Arba Parshiyos Elu, these 4 passages, Kadesh li v'haya kiviyacha, both come from the book of Exodus, from the story of Shemot, and that's right when the Jewish people came out of Egypt, where Hashem gives them the mitzvah to put on tefillin. Shema and v'hayim Shemaya is in Deuteronomy. Those are the second 2 verses. They should be written separately and covered with leather. They are called tefillin. They are placed on the head and tied on the arm. According to Torah law, and again, you see here, if you notice that, the Rambam reverses the order, even though in practice you do the arm first. According to Torah law, even a mere point of one of the letters from these 4 passages prevents all of them from being acceptable. All 4 must be written in the proper manner. Similarly, if even one letter of the 2 passages contained in the mezuzah, which is the Shema and V'hayim Shemaya, so it's only 2 out of those 4. So a mezuzah parchment is lacking a point. It is not acceptable according to Torah law, which requires, again, that they each be written in a perfect manner. Similarly, a Torah scroll which is lacking even 1 letter is unacceptable. When a sofer is checking for a mezuzah, he is checking for the possibility of any one of over 4,000 types of mistakes that could come in. So when people ask me, I'm a qualified rabbi, granted, Rabbi, can you check the mezuzah? I say no, because I can't. I'm not a qualified sofer. The art of writing a mezuzah is a very specific art, and you need to be professional at it. And if you're not doing it and constantly keeping yourself switched on to that, don't try to. Now, you talk here about one letter or one point being somewhat off, disqualifying a whole entire Torah or a mezuzah or tefillin, the loss of thousands of rands. Aren't you being a little bit pedantic? But I think today, when we've become so much more sensitive to every breath, to every cough, when somebody in the supermarket coughs in front of you, you take a step back. Because we're very sensitive that on a physical level, the smallest drop can have that effect. A tefillin and a mezuzah is a manifestation of Hashem's connection to us. And therefore, our sensitivity to the smallest detail is in line with that. There are 10 requirements for tefillin. All of them are halachot transmitted to Moshe on Mount Sinai. Halacha l'Moshe Messina, by the way, means that it has the same status as a law written in the Torah. It is necessary to fulfill them all. Therefore, when changes with regard to them, tefillin are not fit for use. 2 involve the composition of the tefillin, and 8 involve the coverings placed around the passages and tying of their straps. And for the duration of this chapter, we're going to focus on these 2, which are what? They must be written on ink, and they must be written on parchment. Okay? Now, how is the ink prepared? One collects the vapor of oils, of tar, of wax, or the like, causes it to condense, and kneads it together with sap from a tree and a drop of honey. It is moistened, extensively crushed until it is formed into flat cakes, dried, and then stored. What do these all have in common? They're all from the ground. Okay, nothing, there's no animal product in them. When one desires to write with it, one soaks the cakes of ink in galma juice or the likes and writes with it. And thus, and here the Rambam includes a critical ingredient, if one attempts to rub it out or a critical quality, he would be able to. Now, why is it so important to be able to erase it? Why does that make it kosher? So it actually comes from the tractate of Sota. If you remember, the story of the Sota is where the couple that was accused of infidelity would come to the Beis Hamikdash, and if they're guilty, of course the marriage would be dissolved. So we want to do everything possible to preserve this marriage. And so what Hashem says in the Torah is, write my name on the scroll and erase my name into the water, and then she drinks from the water, and that verifies what happened. And the idea is, let my name be erased as long as to preserve the peace in the home of my people. That's how valuable, we could call it that, shalom bayit is, the peace in the home. So I think that's a lesson to all of us as well, by the way, that if we have to erase some of our own ego and honor in order to preserve the peace in the home, it's obviously something important. So because of that, from there we learned that the entire Torah needs to be written with ink that, in theory, could be erased. That's the source that the Gemara uses. When one desires to write with it, this is the ink which is most preferable to write scrolls, tefillin and mezuzahs. If, however, one wrote any of the 3 with galma juice or vitriol is made, it's a very strong ink. It's made from metal that's rotting, which remains without being rubbed out. It is acceptable. Okay, so if you did use it, it's still okay. If so, what is excluded? Meaning, if once you've used it, it's okay anyways. What's excluded by the halacha, conveyed to Moshe, meaning which stated to be written in ink? What is out? It excludes tints of other colors such as red, green, and the like, if even one letter of a Torah scroll, tefillin, or mezuzah is in another tint or in gold, they are invalid. In fact, the Gemara in one of Masechta Ktainas, there's those small tractates of Talmud, one of them is called Masechta Sofrim. And there it describes how Alexander the Great had a Torah commissioned where every name of God was written in gold ink, and the sages said it had to be interred, it had to be set aside. It wasn't kosher to be used. Obviously, they had to be careful with how they stipulated that. Shulchan Aruch says even if you use black ink, this is what some want to do, use black ink and then sprinkle gold dust over the letters to give it an extra shine, that too would have been prohibited. There's three types of parchments, which we'll explain in a moment. What is implied? Behema, so all parchments, obviously, the hide of a domesticated or wild animal, kosher, is taken. First, the hair is removed from it, meaning if the hair is not removed before it's used, it's not kosher, even if you take the hair off afterwards. Afterwards, it's salted and prepared with flour, then resin and other substances which cause the skin to contract and become harder applied to it. In this state, it is called a gvil. Okay, so a gvil is a complete skin of an animal taken and treated and made worthy of use. Okay, that's status number one. After the hair is removed, the hide may be taken and divided in half in the manner known to the parchment processors. Thus, there are two pieces of parchment. A thin one, the one which is on the side where the hair grew, so that would be the side that was exposed to us, and a thicker one on the side of the flesh. So you can take the skin, and the skin processors know how to split them in half. After it has been processed using salt and flour, then resin and the like, the portion on the side where the hair grew is called klaf. If any of you are familiar with the term klipa, which is a peel, that's where the term klaf comes from. Klaf is klipa. And the portion on the side of the flesh is called duchsustus. Okay, where does that come from? Duch is Aramaic for the place of, and sustus is Greek for flesh. So it's the place of the flesh, it's the side of the skin on the inside of the animal. So there's a halacha transmitted to Moshe on Mount Sinai that a Torah scroll should be written on the gvil, on the side on which the hair had grown. Okay? That's where a Torah should be written. When tefillin are written on klaf, they should be written on the side of the flesh. Okay? When a mezuzah is written on duchsustus, it should be written on the side of the hair. And then he concludes, whenever one writes on klaf on the side of the hair, or on gvil on the side of the, or on gvil or duchsustus on the side of the flesh, it is unacceptable. So it has to be written on the side which was hidden. Although it is a halacha which was transmitted to Moshe and Mount Sinai that if one wrote a Torah scroll on the klaf, meaning the outside, it is acceptable, gvil was mentioned only to exclude duchsustus. In which sense, if a Torah scroll is written on the latter, it is not acceptable. Similarly, if a mezuzah was written on the klaf or on the gvil, it is acceptable, and the duchsustus is mentioned only as a mitzvah. When he says here as a mitzvah, meaning a preferable form of performing the mitzvah, but if not, it would have still been okay. Now he continues. Torah scrolls, what are the sources of the skins? Torah scrolls, tefillin, and mezuzahs may not be written on hide from a non-kosher animal, fowl, or wild animal. One may write on all the hides of all kosher animals, wild beasts, and fowl. This applies even when these animals died without being ritually slaughtered or when they were killed by wild beasts. We may not write on the skin of a kosher fish because of the foul secretions, since the processing the skin will not cause the foul secretions to cease, so we don't use the skin. Here is an interesting halacha. He says that in the preparation of the skin of the parchments needs to be done for its intent. Similarly, like other mitzvahs where it has to be done for the sake of matzah, is the classical example. It has to be done for this intent. The gvil for a Torah scroll, the parchment, and the klaf for a tefillin and a Torah scroll must be processed with this purpose in mind. If they were not processed with this intent, they are not acceptable. Accordingly, if they were processed by a Gentile, they are not acceptable. Even when a Jew instructed a Gentile to process the parchment with the intent that it be used for a Torah scroll for tefillin, it is still unacceptable. The Gentile follows his own intentions and not those of the person who hires him, meaning it's about thought. And you cannot force anyone to have thought. Therefore, whenever an article must be made with a specific intent in mind that is unacceptable if made by a Gentile, the parchment used for the mezuzah need not be processed with this purpose in mind. Obviously, the tefillin and the Torah scroll have a higher level of need. It's a halacha transmitted to Moshe on Mount Sinai that a Torah scroll or mezuzah should be written only on a parchment which has been ruled. This is a very interesting idea, and that is the halacha of shirtut. As he says, it's not kosher if it does not have shirtut. The parchment of tefillin einan tzrichen shirtut. The parchment for tefillin, however, need not be ruled because they are covered. Now, obviously, a mezuzah and a Torah are also covered. What does he mean by that? For sure, a mezuzah. But the reality is that it's not part of the mitzvah. Okay? Torah scroll we open up and read from even when it's covered, so that's definite. And even a mezuzah, the casing is not, although it does get a disproportionate amount of attention, the mezuzah case is not part of the mitzvah, whereas tefillin, it is clothed, so the presentation is not as decisive. Meaning you don't look at the tefillin, so the fact that the lines are a bit out of sync isn't a desecration, so to speak, of the honor of the tefillin. It is permissible to write tefillin and mezuzahs. By the way, just so you know how that's done, next time you get an aliyah at the Torah, if you look closely, you'll see that the lines, there's always a little indent on the software takes a ruler and makes a little indent and writes up against that line. It's obviously not written in the ruled lines, but it's like a little engravement in the parchment. It is permissible to write tefillin and mezuzahs without looking at an existing text because everyone is familiar with these passages. It is, however, forbidden to write even one letter of a Torah scroll without looking at an existing text, meaning you need to be looking back and forth. Okay. Sefer Torah, okay, now this halacha combines two very, very different elements. One is people that are possibly against Torah, tefillin and mezuzah, and one is people that are not obligated. Someone who's not obligated in the constant study of Torah, or the writing, not obligated to write a Torah, not obligated to wear tefillin, and to write a mezuzah, is not able to write it. A Torah, tefillin, and mezuzah written by an apikodos should be burned. Apikodos, is somebody who understands Torah, who knows it, who has given all of it in its entirety, and then uses all of that knowledge to fight Torah. If they're written by a Gentile, an apostate Jew, a person who betrays the Jewish people to a powerful person, that's a meister that we learned about at the 13th bracha of the Amidah. A slave, a woman, or a minor, they are not acceptable and must be entombed as implied, and you shall tie and you shall write. What does that mean? Our sages explain this includes only those who are commanded to tie tefillin on their arms. Those who believe in what they write are the ones who write it. Sacred articles, which are found in the possession of apikodos and it is not known who wrote them, should be entombed, because an apikodos has devious intentions. Those which are found in the possession of a Gentile, however, are kosher because they probably came from a regular Jewish scribe. We should not, however, purchase Torah scrolls from Gentiles for more than they are worth, so that do not become, God forbid, accustomed to stealing them. A Torah scroll, tefillin, or mezuzah that was written on parchment from a non-kosher animal, beast, or fowl on parchment that was not processed properly is not acceptable. Okay, so if it was written on this parchment, it's not good. However, a Torah scroll of tefillin that was written on parchment that wasn't processed with the intent to use it for these sacred purposes, is not acceptable. A similar principle. Okay. When a person writes a Torah scroll, tefillin, or mezuzah without having the proper intention. Okay, so let's say the sofer is not thinking about what he's writing. He's thinking about what he's going to have for lunch. Should he write one of God's name without the desired intent? They are not acceptable. Therefore, when a person is writing God's name, he shouldn't reply even if the king of Israel greets him. If he is writing 2 or 3 names, he may interrupt between them and reply. So if he's writing a verse where it says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, and he's finished the name Hashem, and he's about to write Elokeichem, he can interrupt. But one principle which every sofer in the world today still very much fulfills is that extra level of intent when it comes to writing the name of Hashem. But it's not only intent, it's also in practice in how you write, which we'll see now in the next halacha, that when a scribe dips his pen in ink to write God's name, he should not begin writing one of the letters of God's name. Rather, he should begin with the letter preceding God's name. He shouldn't get a refill on his quill for the name of Hashem. Why not? Because often on a refill, you take by unintentionally too much ink, which causes a blotch. And therefore, we would blotch Hashem's name and have to erase it, which obviously you don't want to do. If a scribe forgot to write God's name in its entirety, he may insert it between the lines. It is, however, unacceptable to have a portion of God's name on the line and a portion inserted between the lines. With regards to other words, however, if one forgets, one may write half the word on the line and half above the line. When does the above apply with regard to a Torah scroll? In contrast, with regard to tefillin and mezuzahs, one shouldn't insert even one letter between the lines. Rather, if one forgets even one letter, one should intone what one has written and write another one. And then he concludes, it is permitted to write God's name on parchment where letters have been scraped off or rubbed out on all of these sacred articles. You are still permitted to do that. The scribes who write Torah scrolls, tefillin, and mezuzahs may not turn the parchment face down. Rather, they should spread a cloth over them or fold them. When it comes time when he has to take a break or when he finishes his day's work, you never turn it over to keep it protected. The following rules apply with us when a scribe who wrote a Torah scroll, tefillin, and mezuzah states that the names of Hashem, I did not write them with the proper intent. Once they have left his hand, meaning once he sold them, his statements are not believed with regard to the disqualification of the scroll, except in one element, for one point. They are, however, except to the extent that he must forfeit his entire wage. So a sofer is not allowed to disqualify a Torah scroll, but he can forego his payment. Why isn't he believed? With regard to the disqualification of the scroll, the sages made a rule. Because it's possible that he wanted to cause a loss to the purchaser, to the person who hired him, think that with this statement, all that he would be required to forfeit would be the payment of the names of Hashem. He would say, the names of Hashem weren't written properly. We say, no. If you say anything is not written properly, we disqualify everything. Accordingly, were he said the parchment of his Torah scroll were not processed with the proper intent in mind, his statement are accepted with regard to his qualification as sacred articles, because by virtue of these statements, he forfeits his entire wage. Okay? Everyone knows that if the parchments were not processed with the proper intent, he doesn't deserve any payment. So because that's a much more widely known halacha, that it disqualifies everything, and he knows he's going to lose all of his money, so we actually believe him because he made the statement with the awareness of how much it would actually cost him. Tefillin and mezuzahs may only be written in ksav ashuris, permission, which is the source of the script that we write today. Special permission is granted to write Torah scrolls in Greek as well. That Greek language has, however, that language of Yavanis has been forgotten from the world. It is not the Greek as we know it today. This Rambam was writing, remember, close to 900 years ago. It has been confused and sunk into oblivion. Therefore, at present, all 3 sacred articles may be written using Ksav Ashuri alone. One must be precise while writing them, making sure that one letter doesn't become attached to another one, because any letter which is not surrounded by parchment on all four sides is unacceptable. Meaning, if one letter touches another, it's not good. Now, how do you tell if a letter is clear or not? You have to ask a child. And in fact, I remember when I was a kid in the shul in 770 at the Rebbe's minyan, sometimes in public, one of the Torahs would be disqualified, and you have a shul with thousands of people waiting. What's going to be the rule? And the Rav, the rabbi of the community, Rabbi Marlowe, he actually called up one of the little kids, a 6-year-old kid, and he picked him up over the Torah and said, "What is that letter?" And the kid, it was the child's identification is what gives the go-ahead one way or the other. Any letter that cannot read by a child who is neither wise nor foolish is not acceptable. Therefore, one must be careful with regard to the forms of the letters, so that a yud will not resemble a vav, nor a vav a yud. A kaf should not resemble a beis a kaf, a dal should not resemble a resh a dalid. These are all letters that have small differences between them. The same applies in other similar instances. The text must be written in a manner that a reader will be able to read without difficulty. Okay, and finally, the following rules apply to parchment which has holes. One should not write over a hole. If, however, ink passes over the hole without seeping through, the presence of the hole is of no consequence and may write upon it. Accordingly, if the skin of a fowl is in process, it is permissible to write upon it. The following rules apply when a parchment becomes perforated after it has been written on. If the perforation is within the inside of a letter, example given, in the space inside a hay, inside a member, inside any of the other letters, it is acceptable. Okay, so it's in the letter, there's that open space. Despite the fact that the leg of the letter becomes perforated to the extent it becomes separated into two portions, it is acceptable if, number one, the length of the leg is equivalent to that of a similar letter. Okay, so let's say you have a resh, right? And the side of the resh comes down, but it doesn't come down till where it came, because now there's a little hole at the bottom of it. If it's still coming down that it looks like a letter, that's okay. And the letter's present form doesn't resemble another letter. So the vav, for example, coming down, the bottom of the letter of the vav is now lost because of a hole. If it's not looking like a yud yet, it's okay. If the length of the leg is not equivalent to that of a small letter, it is not acceptable, meaning you would not be able to use it. Sorry, I'm 4 minutes over our time. Any questions? Thoughts?
Rabbi, just a quick question, please. You mentioned earlier that the ink must be such that you're able to take it off, in other words, to correct. Would you be able to do that correction for Hashem's name?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if a Torah scroll has a mistake with Hashem's name, you don't have to throw out the Torah scroll. You're able to. What he said about not starting to write Hashem's name is that you obviously want to avoid that.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
So that's why just make sure your quill is in a you have control, so to speak, of the ink flow out of your quill.
Thank you.
I've got another question for you, but not pertaining to this thing. If you're praying at home on Monday night or Sunday night, do you do the Kol Nidre if you're by yourself?
Definitely.
And you do it 3 times?
Yeah, so you still would say the Kol Nidre. Obviously, it's not ideal because there are texts of the Kol Nidre that refer to the congregation, and you would prefer to do that in the company of a congregation. But if you're not, as many of us are not going to be this year, because halacha doesn't allow us to come to shul if it's going to be putting a life in danger, then you say it without that.
Thank you.
I actually just heard a beautiful story. By the way, the shir is over. If anybody has to leave, don't. I know we're over time, but I heard a beautiful story from a friend of mine who was actually in yeshiva together. His name is Shneir Ashkenazi, and he lives in Israel. He's a rabbi of a yeshuv, and he's the chazan as well. But as a child, he davened in the main shul in Kfar Chabad, and the senior chazan there at the time was a rabbi by the name of Zalman Bronstein, who was a very fine chassid and a beautiful, very powerful. You listen to some of his recordings, it really gives you the chills. And he was always, during the year, was always the chazan, but it came to Kol Nidrei. There was something about his Kol Nidrei that just broke through everything. It really shook everyone. And this boy, this Schneier, my friend, he once, after Yom Kippur, went to visit Rav Zalman in the house. He says, "What's with your Kol Nidrei? The whole show feels something else. Well, what are you feeling then?" And he says, I'll tell you the secret. He was a young man living in Russia. By the way, do any of you know Chaim Bronstein? His wife, in any of the Joburg crowd, his wife is the principal of the Torah Academy primary school. Rebbetzin Altman's sister. Anyways, he's Zalman Bronstein. He's the Chazan's grandson. So during the war, he was living in Moscow and he got drafted into the Red Army, defending Russia from Hitler. And he was there on the front lines. And then one day they came around for an inspection and they were asking everybody to say their name and where they were from. The officer was going through. And he says his name in his voice. He says, no, a voice like this, we're not sending to the front line. I'm sending you to join the Red Army choir. And he joined the choir. And he wasn't far from the theater of war, but he wasn't literally on the front line. And he was put up in the barracks with the whole choir, and they were given a schedule for the month ahead. And he looks and he sees that they're having a big performance for all of the doctors, the medics of the army. The choir is going to do a performance. And he looks, and what is it? In Kippur night. And he doesn't know what to do. And he just decides, it comes Erev Yom Kippur in the morning, he comes he was the lead soloist of the choir. He comes to the head and he tells the guy, I can't, my voice went, and he knew how to play around with his voice. The guy said, what do you mean you're a head solo? I can't, no voice. All right, what should we do? He sends him to his room. So coming at nighttime, and he hears a bang on his door. Bronstein! Yeah, he opens the door. And there's 3 senior officers there. Bronstein, what's tonight? And he's over. He realizes he's been caught, and he could easily, he's a deserter. No question, he can be shot just for that. He just looks at them and he says, it's Yom Kippur. Like, Bronstein, sing for us. And he doesn't know what to do. And he said, no, we're Jewish too. So he starts singing and he said, no. Because it was, he was singing quietly in the hotel room. He said, come with us. In the barrack, And these 3 senior officers, they start walking with him. And they leave the barracks, they leave the camp, they start walking into the forest. Walking until they're far, far away from nobody. And they say, okay, start. And he closes his eyes and he starts singing Kol Nidrei. Here he is alone in the forest with 4 Jews, no minion, no nothing. And he starts singing, and in the middle, he opens his eyes, he turns around and he sees the guys are standing behind him, sobbing their eyes out, these 3 communist Red Army officers. And he says that moment when he saw these guys, he doesn't, they had 0 connection to Judaism, 0 identification with Yiddishkeit, but that Kol Nidrei alone, that showed him what a Yiddish neshama is. So, please God, you won't have any Red Army officers banging on your door Kol Nidrei night. But wherever you're going to be singing Kol Nidrei, just remember that it's not the minyan and it's not the rabbi and it's not the chazan that makes it Kol Nidrei for you. And if you don't believe me, you can ask the officers in the Red Army. I'll tell you.
Rabbi, thank you very much.
A meaningful
Shabbat shalom to everyone.
And Shana Tova.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat shalom and good fast.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom. Have a good fast. Bye.
Cheers, everyone.
Kama Shanti